Are you ready to become the balanced leader you are destined to become? Then stay right here. Welcome to today's Balanced Leader, where we empower today's leader to be the best that you can be, both in your professional and personal life. I'm your host, Caroline Baird, and I've explored and believe the intersection of wellness and leadership are key to finding the balance you are craving as a leader. This is the show where we focus on leadership and the importance of maintaining balance in today's fast-paced and constantly changing world. We talk about topics related to leadership, from communication and team building to personal development and finding balance during challenging times. We will also hear from inspiring guests who have achieved success in their fields and have valuable insights to share about their leadership journeys and on what it takes to be a successful leader. But this podcast isn't just about leadership, it's also about wellness too. Taking care of your mind, body, and spirit is essential to becoming a successful leader, and you'll get tips and strategies for living a healthy, balanced life, from managing burnout and improving mental health, to finding ways to reset and reground during a typical day at work so that you can achieve your goals. So whether you're a CEO, an entrepreneur, or just someone looking to improve your leadership skills, this podcast is for you. Are you ready? Well, let's get going. Hello, and welcome back to today's Balanced Leader. I'm so excited for today's presentation. I'd love to welcome to our podcast Todd Weinstein. He is a certified executive coach with over 2 decades of corporate experience on the inside. Todd collaborates with senior leaders and teams from diverse industries, delivering exceptional and lasting value. His background includes various leadership roles at Fortune 500 companies, where he served as a strategic HR business partner and later led the leadership development and organizational change functions. Todd is also the co-designer of 2 cutting-edge leadership development programs, Communication with Confidence and Presence, and Leadership Accelerator. These programs combine interactive learning experiences with one-on-one coaching, utilizing proprietary technology for unique talent development offerings. And through Gavia Partners, Todd is dedicated to helping his clients bring depth, purpose, and sustainability to their work environments. His approach is wonderful. It involves facilitated team functions with one-on-one dialogue, coaching, assessments, action planning, and follow-up, leading to profound insights and remarkable outcomes, which fosters a sense of shared purpose and collective ownership. I have known Todd for a number of years, and so excited to have Todd with us here today. So Todd, welcome to our today's Balanced Leader episode, where we're going to be speaking about strategy and innovation thinking for our leaders. So welcome, Todd. So excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Carolyn. Great to be with you, and wonderful to be on your podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. So Todd, I know you've been doing this for a number of years, and I hate to age us when I say that because I emphasize number. But when we think about how leadership has changed over the years, maybe we can start a little bit with what have you seen evolve over the years, and how has that strategy and innovation spirit really changed over the time?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. And I think when I look at that subject of strategy and innovation over the course of many years, it can give us a different perspective than the way we might look at it, in a shorter snapshot in time. To me, strategy and innovation are connected to predictability. And what I mean by that is, in the past, I think we have had more predictable ways of seeing the world, of the levers that are operating to drive business forward. Anything that we have been able to bring focus to, that we can plan around and do strategic planning because we know certain economic factors or certain geographic factors are going to happen, has made it easier. Today, I feel like that has gone out the window. And we are now in a world where a lot less is predictable. If the last few years have taught us anything, And so that means strategy and innovation has changed. The way that we disrupt certain markets, the way that certain businesses have gotten started in totally new and unexpected ways, and obviously the way the market conditions have changed means that it's harder for leaders to do strategy the traditional way. And I think that carries over to leadership. We've had very, predictable leadership models, and these are certain leadership competencies that all leaders should have. And these days, I think that has really shifted into new skill sets and much more comfort in navigating the ambiguity and complexities of the world. So that's what I'm noticing at a high level is these days, if you are trying to do strategy the traditional way in predictable models, it's not working. And that's why we see changes from project management moving into agile. That's why we see changes in the way that strategic planning is done. And the time horizons have shifted from 5 to 10 years out to more like 2 to 5 years. So everything has shifted because it's becoming a lot harder to predict. And that means much more adaptability and agility is going to be needed.
Right. And I think, and we talked a little bit about this previously, when you think about how connected you need to be to the world globally, as far as it's not just knowing what your business itself does, it's the competition, but it's also understanding the consumer to some degree to be able to be innovative and strategic.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And it's also about how do I understand the whole system that my business works in? I mean, we saw with COVID, for example, that consumer products were totally dependent on supply chain, but no one really thought about that before until the supply chain got interrupted and the manufacturing got interrupted. And suddenly people were realizing, oh, well, we can't get batteries made, or things can't get shipped, or steel that we were getting from China isn't available. So suddenly the systemic nature of business became everyone's focus and awareness. No one thought about those things before. So just thinking about how interdependent all these things are, I think is important for us as leaders to, if we're going to do strategy well, to really understand the systems in which we operate.
Right. And so if you think about today's leader and finding that balance between the need for short-term results, but also thinking long-term innovation and strategy, because of course, long-term could change quickly, and we found that out through COVID, but
Right.
What would you say is something that leaders should be thinking about today in order to change maybe their mindset with respect to short-term and long-term focus on their business?
I think leaders today always need to be looking ahead and scanning the environment. They need to understand that if I'm not paying attention to what's coming, whether that's a trend or a pattern or any kind of, let's say, demographic shift, those things, if those things aren't being paid attention to, then we run the risk as leaders missing an opportunity, or maybe in a worst case scenario, being totally disrupted or going out of business because we didn't pay attention to certain things. There are dozens and dozens of examples of businesses that are no longer in business because they didn't pay attention to those things. They didn't, Blockbuster Video, as an example, could have been on the leading edge of streaming and they didn't end up there. Netflix could have stayed in DVD rentals, but they shifted, so things like that, to pay attention to and notice what is happening in technology, what is happening in society. Those things always have to be, paid attention to. We also have to be ready to pivot, right? If we are so tied as leaders to one idea or one focus or one mission, then we may miss the opportunity to shift into something new. And so to be too attached to any one thing can also be a problem. So to your question around short versus long-term, we need to have the long-term perspective, be looking out and up to see what's coming. We also have to have our kind of eyes on the ground and be ready to drop onto the ground like a helicopter and just get out there and see what's happening right here that may require us to adjust and shift. One of the leaders of a company that I worked for used to use that helicopter analogy a lot. And I think it's very appropriate for leaders because you have to be looking up and out, but you also have to know when to drop down and sort of see what's on the ground, because that may shift your understanding of the terrain. That may change the way that you operate. So it's a constant balance moving back and forth between those. And the leaders who I work with who do it well spend time in both areas very consciously and very intentionally.
And so I'm sure in part of your course, you learn how some of the tips around doing that, because sometimes we have the best intent to do certain things and it doesn't always happen. Is there anything that you would recommend to somebody in order to make sure that they're always attributing to that? And then part two of that question is, so how do you foster that culture within your team?
Yeah, great question. I think the first thing is leaders obviously have to be well informed, right? So if they're not reading, if they're not making sure they're looking at certain videos, listening to podcasts, understanding what's going on in the world today, whether that is political, economic, social, technological, any of the big sectors, if you will, where they need to be thinking about how those things will connect to them, then they may be missing an opportunity. But the other thing is just connecting with people. If we don't have relationships with people outside of our immediate circles, I think we miss an opportunity. I work with a lot of physicians, for example, in the healthcare field. So it's very easy for a physician to get very fixated and lost in their own immediate world of healthcare, their hospital system, or even going deeper into subspecialties and research and all sorts of things that are very important for their profession. But if they're stepping into a leadership role and they're administering, they become administrators, that can become a real challenge for them to innovate and be strategic because they are so connected only to the people in their immediate healthcare circle. So a lot of the work I'll do with leaders in those spaces who want to be more strategic and innovative is, how do you get out of your day-to-day? How do you connect with people maybe on a broader regional or national level, in other industries, in other areas? How do you do reading or video viewing of things that are out of your immediate, and then think about how do we bring those things back in to our field? And that's the part that I think is easily done through relationships, connecting with people on LinkedIn, going to conferences, but not seeking out the people who just do exactly what you do, actually connecting with and having conversations with people who are in quite different areas, and then thinking about what are the connection points between that person's world and mine.
Right. I love that. And the HR space, sometimes it's all about policies and procedures, but sometimes you can see what another company has done, to your point, in a completely different stream of work, that they're doing something that you would never have thought of, but that you can somehow take the idea and bring it in and change it so that the model fits for what you do. But I love that, because if you just speak to the people that you're working with, chances are you're not going to be able to think globally and in scope and think about what others do. So I love that idea about, being in the medical system, because that would be really difficult, especially nowadays.
Absolutely. And if you think in that way, you also have to be sort of creative in that way. Mm-hmm. So to be able to give yourself permission to look at it through a totally different lens, or even have a conversation with someone in your own field to propose an idea that seems very unexpected or out of left field, and yet it may be the exact thing that your field or your industry needs. Think of how many people are out there working in companies, raising their hands, trying to propose an idea that could be the next best idea, but they're being shut down or told, this isn't something that we do here, or we've never done it that way. Those are going to be the strategic innovators. And whether or not they stay at those companies or go somewhere else, it's those people who have the courage to sort of step up and offer those ideas. That's going to be what leadership looks like, I think, in the future in this space. It's also being able to speak truth to what might be a prevailing norm that isn't going to be feasible anymore.
Right. I love that idea of stepping out of your comfort zone. And I think that's an attribute that many leaders should do more and more of, because the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with it, is being able to challenge those that have made the decisions to say, that's not what I want to do in my part of the business, and here's why.
And as coaches, so much of our work is helping people step outside of their comfort zone into not just a place of discomfort, but a place of learning, a place of growth, and a place of new awareness building, so that they can apply that new awareness to themselves, to their teams, or to their businesses.
Pivoting a little bit, when you think about, and I'm going to use the term risk taking because everybody uses risk taking, there is that fear or that apprehension at times to be that risk taker. But a lot of, companies often will say, we want you to take risks. That's how we're going to learn. But people are fearful because, of course, when the risk is good, that's wonderful. But when you've now lost money or you're now stuck with a product that you can't get rid of, that's not so good. What would you say, in your opinion, what does the role of risk taking mean today?
I love that question. It is clear to me that from the work that I do, a lot of companies will say, we want to fail forward, fail fast, we want to encourage mistakes. And yet, when you get into these companies and you talk to leaders who work in these companies every day, you realize that's not really a lived value. Those people who try that sometimes are told, don't take those risks anymore, or they're so worried. Someone's always looking over their shoulder to make sure they're doing things carefully and safely. And that obviously can get in the way of a company being innovative. And yet you can run into the other side on the end of the equation, where people are so open to taking risks and trying things that they're actually not able to bring any rigor to what they're doing. So calculated risk is the way I look at it. You can't just take a risk. You have to be thoughtful about, what is this going to entail? And you have to be conversant in it. You have to be able to talk to and communicate, here's what this risk is, here's why it's worth taking, here's what I think will happen as a result, and here's what we hope to learn. And that learning piece is so important, to help the organization understand that even if it doesn't go right, in quotes, or gives us the perfect outcome, just like any scientific experiment, we are going to learn what doesn't work and gain some knowledge about what will. So to be able to help people understand there's a calculated risk here takes a lot of work to be able to articulate that, analyze it, and have the influence skills to get out there and sell your idea, help people understand that it's worth taking. That also means building buy-in and a coalition of other people who can support you. You can't be out there taking risks on your own. You have to build networks of people within your organization to support that idea and to be on board with it. And I think if you can do that, if you can initiate versus wait for things to just happen, if you can be the leader who can build a coalition of risk-taking in ways that helps engender good learning and growth, that's where businesses really succeed, because they are thoughtful about the risks they take. They take calculated risks, but they're not afraid to try something new because that's the culture there. So that's a general statement on it. And I think there's great examples of both. Companies that take great risks and companies that are paralyzed to try anything new, and out of fear of doing it wrong or being found out or being told, we don't want to take any risks here because the board of directors doesn't want that, or whatever reason that is. So it's a tricky thing to do, but if it's done well, it can make a huge difference.
And I think prior to, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think prior to being a risk taker, that you have to be really strong in the area of being able to pivot, being able to measure and being able to pivot. Because if you truly believe in this new innovation that you want to do and you want to take the risk, you have to be able to measure and understand what's happening, good, bad, and different. But then you also need to think through and potentially ahead of time. So if this happens, how are we going to pivot? If this happens, how are we going to pivot? And what potentially the outcomes could be. And I think it's great, to your point, to have those collaborators with you, because you can certainly have those conversations and be really armed with a lot of knowledge from different areas to be able to support and think through the ideas, like a brainstorming session, right?
Yeah, when I'm working in this space with groups of leaders, oftentimes we're doing, a lot of scenario planning. What could happen here? What if this happens? Things like that. And I like tools like the pre-mortem, which is, really, let's imagine this thing goes horribly wrong. And what went wrong? Let's really think through all the potential things, looking back from the future. If this project failed, what failed about it? And we really look at that. And then we bring that back into the planning process. Okay, so what could we do to mitigate those potential failures rather than waiting for the postmortem and only learning from it future back? You can start to imagine that. So, again, as coaches, we can be good at helping people envision into the future and think about not just what success looks like, because that's important too, but what does failure look like and how do we begin to mitigate for that? That can be a very practical way of doing some scenario planning that can help people think through those things so that they actually can feel more comfortable taking the risks that they need to.
I love that. I think too, being a coach who loves to run programs, sometimes programs, it's all about timing as well, right? And I make light of that, but there are times where the timing is so critical, and not pushing through things if you're not going to hit the right timing that you feel is valuable for that risk or that innovation idea. Have you seen that happen a lot, or people?
I think people have definitely become more thoughtful about timing. And we saw a shift with that, like with inventory, for example, a lot more just-in-time inventory. So companies weren't getting caught with too much product on hand or things. Obviously, secondary markets and Amazon and all these things have really changed the way products are sold. An interesting example for me, and there's so many coming out of COVID, was working with a restaurant company and watching how they pivoted and adapted to the fact that they were largely a seafood restaurant company. They had other products, but a lot of what they did was seafood. They have their own supply chain of seafood purveyors. And suddenly, the complete and total halt of the restaurant industry at a time where they had inventory that was going to go bad. So the way that they dealt with that, opened up local markets and took all of their product, advertised to customers, set up outdoor markets, and sold crab legs, fish, all sorts of things that were such good quality, but people, weren't normally going to be able to get that at a typical grocery store or things like that. But they loved their product so much, and suddenly they were just able to sell off all their inventory and not have to watch that all go to waste, and B, they created customer goodwill because they were able to then, they had people calling them after going, are you going to set up another one of those markets, because it was so popular. So to me, that's a great example of a very quick pivoting innovative idea that says we don't have to accept that that was a risk. They could have found that didn't work, and they had spent all this time and money on labor that wouldn't have paid off, but for them it was worth taking that risk, and they really thought it through. And not only did it help the immediate problem, to your question before, but also it helps the long term, because it built goodwill for their brand. So I think just being able to think like that and ask the questions, what if we tried this, is a really important thing for leaders to do, especially working in teams, to be able to do that together.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we don't always, when we have an idea, we're so gung-ho for the idea. We think about all the good, but you never think about, and I'll call it the disruptive threats that could happen, that, who would have known that would have been an issue, right? But you really do have to think about all the different things that could happen so that you've got the proper plan and able to adapt and move quickly. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what do you think, if I was a leader who had a great idea and I wanted to take an initiative that I had come up with and present it, what would you say would be some great steps that somebody out of the gate could start with? And I know we've talked some, but maybe just to kind of highlight them for some of our listeners.
I think if I were working with a leader who had a great idea and they wanted to present that to their organization or have it be heard, The first thing that I might suggest is to help that leader think through, who are the stakeholders around my idea? If I'm going to present something, who are the people who will be impacted by that idea? And I have to think vertically, up and down to leadership or further down into the front lines. I have to think horizontally, my peer group, other functions, how would they be impacted? Like, I'm working with a sales team right now. They introduced all sorts of new sales processes, but what they hadn't considered is how much of the work that they were changing was also going to impact other functions in their business. I shouldn't say they didn't consider that. They hadn't fully appreciated the gravity and the totality of it, right? So how do I think horizontally? How do I think vertically? And then how do I think diagonally? Other parts of this industry or other areas. So if I don't have an idea of how this is going to impact other stakeholders, I need to think that through and have that built into my plan. And then the next thing I have to do is be able to articulate it. I have to be able to communicate it. I do a lot of work with my colleague Jen on communicating and helping leaders become clear, concise, and compelling in the way they communicate. That's a part of it too. And if you have the greatest idea, but you don't know how to talk about it in a way that people can digest it, understand it, and even more so take action on it, your idea won't fly. So you have to know how to talk about your idea or articulate it, write about it, whatever that might be. And you have to have it well thought through so that when you do present it, you're not getting a lot of questions that you haven't thought through and have answers to. That's one of the surefire ways for your idea not to get pushed forward, is to be paralyzed whenever you're asked a question that challenges your idea even a little bit. It doesn't mean you have to have every idea thought through. And it's okay sometimes to say, that's a great question. I need to give that some thought and come back to you. But then to do that follow-up work and circle back within the next few days and say, this has really been helpful. Here's my thought on that, gives people confidence and comfort that you know what you're doing and that your idea is feasible. So I think the communication side and the alignment side within or even outside of the organization is really important. And then I sometimes will recommend tools, books, ideas for leaders who want to get into this space. One well-worn thing is the 6 thinking hats, Edward de Bono's work. I mean, it's still really relevant to think through, how do we look at a problem or an issue from different angles, from what's possible, from what the risks are, all those things. And even to be able to have a conversation with yourself about all those different perspectives can be useful. And then there's a book and a bunch of tools around strategic and creative thinking called Thinker Toys. I use that a lot too. Those types of things can be ways to expand people's thinking or ways of looking at a problem, so that if you're not naturally the kind of person who does that, but you run them through these filters, suddenly you have new insights. Or better yet, get together with a group of trusted advisors and have that conversation with them, and you will automatically walk out with new ideas. But again, having the initiative, the courage, the wherewithal to do that, that's what sets apart people whose ideas get listened to and acted upon, and those who their ideas just sit with them, but they don't end up going anywhere.
Yeah, and I love that, Todd, because one of the things that I was giggling because I remember somebody asking about that, and me telling them that they should involve certain individuals, because I knew they weren't necessarily individuals who were just going to be passive and agree with the individual's idea. You really do need to get the naysayers or the people that are going to challenge you a bit. It's never, it's never an attack on somebody personally. It certainly has you thinking holistically about everything, as opposed to finding people who are just going to agree with you, right? And say, that's Absolutely. A great idea.
If you don't have a good number of skeptics involved in your process, then you are going to miss something. And what you want is not a cynic, but a skeptic, right?
I love that.
If you bring someone in who's just going to say no to everything because that's just who they are, that's not as helpful. But if you bring someone who has a very thoughtful, contrarian point of view, and they're going to listen, but they're also going to challenge, those are the people that can help your idea grow and get better and better. And I think if you don't have skeptics involved, you're missing a huge opportunity from what I've seen when it comes to strategy and innovation. If you have a bunch of cynics involved, you might get very frustrated because they aren't willing to give you any latitude or ideas. They're just going to tell you no.
Right. And then your idea will die and somebody else will make a lot of money on it.
There you go.
See that? I think about Dragon's Den sometimes. I had that idea.
Think of how often that happens, right?
It happens a lot.
And we
Post-it
go,
notes.
oh, how come I didn't take that idea forward? Someone else did.
Yes.
And, persistence is a huge part of it too, right?
Right.
Just keeping at it and becoming a real evangelist for your idea is a big part of it. You can't run out of steam just because you got a few people saying no and you didn't get anywhere the first time. You have to keep pushing that idea and finding new ways for it to be heard.
Right. And so when we talk about communication, because that's the other piece that I think can be a struggle for a lot of us at times, to be able to sell an idea, you don't have to regurgitate everything you've done in order to present an idea. So you want to be succinct while giving enough information for them to say, let's bring another group of people together because I love this idea. What would you say to our listeners is a great way to begin that? Is there a book that you've read? Obviously there's a great course that Todd offers around that, but what would you recommend around that?
Yes. Well, of course, communicating with confidence and presence is a course that we put together. And I would say we have distilled a number of ideas that can be helpful there. But I think there are great tools out there on communication that are really helpful. First of all, Marilee Adams has a book called Change Your Questions, Change Your Life, right? And so the idea of how do I use questions in my dialoguing? How do I recognize that when I'm trying to present an idea, it's not just about the statements I'm making, but the questions that I use that drives the thinking and helps people attach to that idea is really valuable. The work of Judith Glaser on conversational intelligence is another example of great thinking around this. It's building the language and the partnership with people. How do I help direct the conversation, but also keep it open and mutual so we're building an understanding together rather than just trying to convince you that my idea is right. And then the structure of what we say, like a book like The Pyramid Principle is a great example of how do I lead with the headline and share just enough information, because a huge opportunity for people around communication is giving way too much detail and way too much background and then finally getting to the solution. And of course, that's because we've all learned, maybe in academic environments or something, that's how you make your case. You build up all of your arguments and you show everything, and then you finally land on your conclusion. Well, in business, it's the opposite. We have to start with the headline and say, this is what I'm proposing. And then these are the supporting reasons and rationale behind that. But just to give enough, not to go so into detail, and then to pause and ask the question like, what else do you need to know to be clear about what I'm proposing? What other depth could I go? Audience are intelligent adults. They're going to tell you what they need. And if we don't honor that and respect that they're going to ask for what they need, then we might make assumptions and go into way too much depth that we don't need to, which can then frustrate them or have them feel like we're being talked down to, or any number of kind of storytelling things that can get started. So to me, less is more. That's a big part of what we share in what we do in the communication work. And also being really clear about yourself, your voice, understanding how do I communicate at my best. Not everyone has to say it the same way for it to be effective. Right. So a big part of it is aligning the inner experience of understanding who I am to show up authentically and be able to say that. And when I do that, people are drawn to it because they're like, this person is being real and they're being clear. Not they're just trying to emulate or do something that a TED Talk speaker does. And then it becomes obvious when someone's just trying to sort of fake their way through it. So right. I think it's kind of a blend of the authenticity, the structure of the message, and being really clear about, why are you saying what needs to be said to the audience? What do they need to hear rather than what do I think I have to share with them, which is way too much detail.
Right. And I always would try and guide individuals, have your information there, but certainly the individuals that you're presenting to will ask the questions. You've got the data potentially there that you can speak to. But even if you're doing slides, you don't want to have all that information on a slide. It's going to be too much. And sometimes that then becomes an issue, because when you're presenting at that level, of course, they're going to ask you to partner with certain individuals anyways to make sure that it's going to work. But being more succinct, I think, is a better way to get your point across. If you're in a certain role, they're already trusting that you've got the ability to do your homework and come to the table with some great ideas.
Absolutely. And that idea of visuals is another whole area for communication. How much do we, put on the slide? How many things are competing for the message that we're trying to share? Because how many times have you gone into a presentation and you're basically looking at a short story or a novel on the screen? What does that mean for the audience? Well, now I'm reading what you've put in front of me and not listening to what you're saying. So fewer bullets, more visuals, using images or slides to anchor your message, not to replace it or to compete with it. That's a huge opportunity.
I love that. I love that. And that's something that you teach in your communicating with confidence.
We definitely get into some of that. What I would say is our signature program is less about tips, tricks, and tools on how to write a PowerPoint slide or present, and more about how do we align our inner experience and the outer experience so that our demonstrated behaviors when we're communicating are going to show up and help us be at our best, and that we understand enough about ourselves as individuals that we can bring forward our most confident, most authentic selves in whatever situation we're in, whether it's a presentation, a board meeting, a negotiation, any interaction with our team. I mean, communication is a very broad topic, and we look at it as a meta skill, an essential meta skill for anything a leader is doing, because you're communicating all the time. And so presentations and PowerPoints and things like that are a sliver of what we're doing when we're communicating. But we do touch on that and help people understand some of those best practices for sure.
So these, and just so for our listeners to know, when this is more of a program for experienced leaders already, and honing some of those attributes for them to be able to be even more effective, as opposed to you're a new leader and we're going to teach you.
Right. We have really two programs. One is what I'll call an in-depth immersion program for sort of mid to senior level leaders. That's the one I was just talking about. But then we also have sort of an intro one-day overview of those skills that is probably more geared towards individual contributors or new leaders who are new to this stuff, just to begin to introduce them to some of these concepts and tools. That one's probably more tips and tricks involved, because there's just so much for people to learn. And what I find is when leaders earlier on in their career can put focus on the way they're communicating, it can change what ideas get heard from them. It can change the trajectory of their careers because people see them as ready, in our talent space in HR. It can change the relationships they're building. There's so many things that communication is tied to. Oftentimes, though, with traditional leadership and communication courses, it's more about how do you stand? How do you gesture? What do you say? And it's not that those things aren't important, but I think there's more to it than that. So that's why this area, I think, has had such resonance for me and my colleague, because we see communication or miscommunication coming up so often.
Yes. No, and I love that, because I think communication is one of the things that has changed a lot over time. I mean, you even think about in the introduction of technology and what that's done, and gone are the days where you'd write a report and you'd leave it on somebody's desk. But also, to your point, when you're presenting something, you've got a sliver of their time. You need to get your point across quickly, so that they potentially will say, I'll get back to you, or we'll set up another meeting, or whatever that looks like. But yeah, you need to be very succinct when you're presenting as a leader nowadays.
Well, and I think we see this a lot in our world of, maybe building proposals or presenting things to clients, I used to, write out proposals and send them off, and then I would not hear back, and then I'd follow up and I'd wonder, what happened. I don't do that anymore. Just today I met with a leader with whom I'm doing some work. I was going to send her the deck ahead of time, and I said, no, we're going to have the meeting, walk her through it, explain the things that I want to articulate, and then send it to her afterwards so that she can then digest it and spend more time with it, and then we can follow up. Always having the conversation be the center point, not the document or the slideshow. And I think that's made a difference for the way I've been able to talk about the work that I do, or even establish better client relationships, because people want to be in conversation. They don't necessarily just want to read through your report. And even if they do, how do we know they're going to understand it the way we intended? That only happens through conversation and dialogue and questions and answers.
And also understanding exactly what they're looking for. So when you have that conversation, you can absolutely make sure that you're both on the same page, because that's what drives to success, as opposed to, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, right?
Right. And that goes back to your question before about how do you present an idea in your company. If you can't make it relevant to people, then it could be the best idea, but it doesn't get seen as being the best idea because it doesn't seem relevant to them. So to be able to connect their experience with your idea is really the art form in all this.
Right. When we think about challenges that they're going to get, I'm going to shift with you just a little bit. And because I know you and I have talked a lot about assessments as well. So when I'm thinking about communication, when I'm thinking about working with collaborators and finding individuals that are not cynics, that will certainly be vested in helping you attain what it is that you're trying to attain. What would you say? So a lot of times people will come up to, at least when I was in HR, and they still do in coaching, where if a leader comes forward, I'll always ask them if they have some form of feedback, goals, assessments, anything like that, so that I can understand kind of what others are saying about them, because they can't always see what others see in them. What would you say how leaders should be addressing some of these improvements, especially when you think about the leadership skills? So, a lot of times your leader will give you some feedback, and it may not be something that you're thrilled about, but I find that a lot of individuals will take it at a very high level. So I know you're very versed in a lot of the assessments. Would love to hear kind of the guidance that you give to people. So now I've got my assessment, Todd. What do you recommend I do with that assessment?
Yeah. It's a great thing to think about. First of all, I think, to your point, when we get feedback, it's not usually very helpful. Right. It's usually fairly high level. I think you kind of have to work on this. And I don't think that's because people don't intend for it to be helpful. I think it's that we are, again, not very good at being clear and articulate about what we mean by that, or what that would look like. So the first thing we can always do is ask for more specifics, right? When you get a piece of feedback, to ask a question like, well, what would that look like if I could get better at that? What would you see me doing? What would the impact be for others? To be able to ask a few questions that probe a little deeper, oftentimes those answers will be right there, and that person can share back with you, well, what I mean by that is in this context or in these meetings, or you're really good with your team, but you struggle sometimes to respond on the fly when you're with more senior leadership, or things like that. So to be able to be clear about the context or the place, asking some questions is really important. In other words, you can assess right away by asking questions and learning from your colleagues, your peers, your boss, whatever that might be. As far as assessments, I mean, there are so many assessments out there, and many of which are very valuable for different things. Once I have a client go through an assessment, we then have to make sense of it. We have to think about it in the context of their work. So it could be Strengths Finder and their understanding their strengths. It could be EQ, an emotional intelligence assessment that helps them get a better sense of how they're regulating their own emotional state or working with others to build relationships. Or it could be something big like the Hogan assessments, where they're going through a really in-depth battery of 3 different assessments, and we're putting it all together: their values, their motivators, their strengths, and their challenge areas. Whatever it is, it's usually too much data and more than they can necessarily do everything with or process all at once. So we have to take it bit by bit and go through it and understand it and interpret it. In other words, how does this data really show up for me in the workplace, or where does this show up outside of work, when I'm at home with my kids or my spouse or my partner? And then what is important? And so a lot of what we do around assessments is A, understand and interpret, and B, get focused on those few things that will make the biggest difference. So what are 1 or 2 things that would help make the biggest difference for you in the next 6 months or a year? Once we have those things, that's what feeds into the development plan. That's where we get started. That's where we develop a few tangible practices that I can go try. And when I get that done and I have some confidence around that, then we can come back to the assessment and say, let's pick another thing. What would another thing be here? So what I find with assessments is they usually give us way more data than we need. So the work that we have to do as coaches with leaders, but even leaders on their own, when they get an assessment result, maybe there's no one there to interpret, is just to sit with it and think about, what does this really mean for me? Where does it show up? And what are the 1 or 2 areas that I could begin to put some focus on and practice around? That, and usually these assessments will give you developmental suggestions and ideas. So what I say to leaders, let's go through those and just highlight those few things that you might have energy around trying, and start there. That's going to be the best way to make forward progress, rather than trying to do everything at once.
Right. And I love that, because I think sometimes they read each response and try to figure out who said it and why, as opposed to what you're saying is big picture. And I love where you brought up, and where does that come up? Does that come up at home? Does it come up at work? Where does that come up? Is it under a certain situation? Because you may not see the same type of a response in every element of your life. But by being able to understand big picture first, and I've often said, talk to your leader first, because your leader knows you best and can probably give you guidance if you're wanting to grow into that next level of what it is you need. But don't just stop there. Ask colleagues, but ask other leaders at that same level as your manager, so that you can get a different understanding from others. So my leader may see me a particular way, but it doesn't mean that his colleague in a different department sees that. They may be like, oh, I think you're awesome at that. Well, where's the disconnect to your point, and why is that?
Yeah,
I love that.
Absolutely. I mean, here's a really simple assessment. I just gave this to a client to do for the next time we meet. Pick 5 people who know you well. They could be at work, they could be, colleagues at work, or they could be friends or family members, or anyone who you know and trust. And ask them, what are 5 words that describe me at my best? And what are 5 words that describe me when I'm not at my best? And then they're going to come back, and they're going to have 50 words. And we're going to look at those words together and kind of sift them out. We'll have 2 columns of 25 words. And then we're going to highlight any themes that stand out, maybe the same word that was offered 3 or 4 times. And from there, we're going to look at, so which of these qualities that you're at your best do we want to build from and grow from? And then which of these qualities that were described when you're not at your best do you want to pay attention to or work on? And if we end up with, just even a couple of words from each of those lists, that will give us more clarity about where to go next. And that's a very simple, free assessment that we can do. And what he's going to do, because he wants it to sort of be really easy for people to give, is he's going to build a little survey monkey or whatever and send that out and have them do it a little bit more anonymously, so they don't have to tell it to them directly. Right. So I think we'll get different data that way. It's not a very involved assessment. It's not, a scientifically validated thing that we had to spend hundreds of dollars on, but it will lead to insight and awareness. So that's just a simple way to get started if we have the courage to ask.
Yes. So you don't have to go out and do the Hogan assessment.
Right. Now, if he wants to do that, we can do that too. But not everyone's ready for that or needs some deep psychological personality profile to gain self-awareness. And so I try to meet clients where they are and based on what they need. And sometimes I'm working, with a senior vice president who's like, I don't even know where to start. And that might be when something like Hogan can be really valuable, because we're going to give them a whole bunch of data to consider. And if they're data minded, which many senior leaders are, it's a great starting point for them to go, oh, now I have a sense of not just how I see myself, but how others experience me. And that's where the value comes in with assessments.
I love that. I love that. Todd, anything else that you want to share with our listeners? I mean, we could go into body language, and we could go into so much. Looking at my phone while you're talking to me.
There are so many things. It's such a rich topic. I suppose I would just say, I think if you're not thinking about the way you're communicating along with the way you're thinking about or bringing ideas forward for strategy, innovation, then I think it's a missed opportunity. I think it's all of those parts playing together that helps leaders be more strategic and more innovative. Yes, we have to work through our own thinking challenges around risk-taking or long-term versus short-term thinking or any of these things. And we also have to be willing to think about the way that we get our message across and that we bring other people into the process of buying into and supporting what we're wanting to do, or sometimes challenging, and we come up with a better idea because of that conversation. I mean, I've talked to a lot of leaders who said, I thought I had a good idea, and then I took it out and socialized it with a bunch of people, and it made my idea better, but it also changed my idea. Mm-hmm. Having the willingness to say, maybe my idea is not the perfect idea, but it's going to become better because I brought it to the attention of other people who I know and trust and who are willing to speak the truth to me. Now suddenly that idea can really take off.
I love that. I love that great summary. Thank you for that. That's wonderful. And for our listeners, I've been writing down all the names of the books that Todd referred to. So I'll be including them at the bottom of the summary so that you can take a glance and see if those were one of the books that you'd like to read. But thank you, Todd, so much. This was so impactful for our listeners. I'm very excited. And as always, if you have anything that you'd like to add or ask, you'll have Todd's information to be able to get in touch with him if you've got a question around his programs. And of course, you'll have my contact information always. So if you've got a question, happy to explore for you as well. So thank you so much again, Todd. Really, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And I love that we've been able to have this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you so much. That's all for this episode of Today's Balanced Leader. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion on wellness and leadership, and that you took away some valuable insights and strategies to help you become a better leader in your own life. Please leave a rating and review. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the next one, as we continue our exploration of what it means to live life as today's leader. In the meantime, take care of yourself and remember that true leadership starts with taking care of your own well-being. One deep breath in and one deep breath out. Keep striving for excellence and inspiring others to do the same. And finally, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Today's Balanced Leader.